Call the hearing to order. The Joint Economic Committee is holding this hearing because entrepreneurship matters. It matters because startup businesses drive the innovation that fuels economic growth and opportunity, and very importantly, entrepreneurs matter because nearly all the gains in job creation come from businesses less than a year old, true startups. The bad news is that the rate of startups has been declining over the past few decades. That decline became an outright collapse during this recovery when for 3 straight years, as the chart shows, companies closed their doors more rapidly than they were opened. During similar periods in recent recoveries, the greatest gains in the number of American companies occurred during the Reagan administration, perhaps not coincidentally, when tax rates were falling. In contrast, this recovery saw only about a fifth of the business growth. That has real consequences for middle-class families. According to analysis by the Economic Innovation Group, each startup creates an average of 6 jobs. Plentiful startups and jobs create an average of 6 jobs. Plentiful startups and jobs create a virtuous cycle where potential entrepreneurs are more willing to take a risk on a new venture. By the same token, weak levels of entrepreneurship and job creation create a downward spiral for both. Another alarming trend is that the number of places where startup growth is actually happening is shrinking, a topic we investigated in a hearing earlier this year. From 2010 to 2014, half of all businesses growth occurred in just 5 metropolitan areas. Blighted areas across the country are desperate for new businesses and the jobs and opportunities that come with them. That's why I introduced the Bipartisan Investing and Opportunity Act to attract capital and investment in distressed communities, and I hope that it becomes part of tax reform. Tax reform is a key tool in our policy arsenal that could remove artificial barriers to starting a business and fostering an environment where entrepreneurship can thrive. Truth be told, entrepreneurs probably don't think much about taxes when they launch a startup, and they shouldn't have to. But before long, they're hit with mind-numbing complexity that drains precious resources from their businesses. They may spend every dime of profit buying expensive equipment to scale up production, but the tax code may not allow them to immediately deduct the costs. That means they'll owe taxes on profits they no longer have. If they do manage to become profitable, startups that are corporate taxpayers will face the highest tax rate in the developed world, and successful startups that pay individual taxes because they're set up as pass-through businesses will face even higher potentially individual rates that have increased dramatically over the years. The tax code also punishes success by forcing family business owners to do costly estate planning so the death tax doesn't steal their ability to pass the business to the next generation of entrepreneurs. In this increasingly global economy, entrepreneurs can start or move a business anywhere in the world they choose. Yet our tax system is out of step with our competitors. Tax reform done right will grow jobs and grow paychecks, helping restore the virtuous cycle that gives entrepreneurs the confidence to take a risk and reach high for the American dream. Tax reform done right will provide them more capital, the lifeblood of entrepreneurs. And it will make America the best place in the world to invest and to start a business. Our future prosperity depends on it. I look forward to hearing the thoughts of our excellent panel of witnesses today, and we'll introduce them in a moment, but I would first like to recognize our ranking member, Senator Heinrich, for his opening statement. Welcome.
Thank you, Chairman Dearie, and thank you to all of our witnesses for being here today. The tax reform debate is underway, and I'm happy that our committee is taking this opportunity to examine the nation's tax policy. I agree that our tax code needs to be simpler for families and for small businesses. Where we can promote policies that make sure that the tax code is working for working Americans, growing the economy, creating good-paying jobs, and supporting families and communities across the country, I will be among the first to support it. Unfortunately, the Republican starting point seems heavily focused on giving more tax giveaways to large multinational corporations and the wealthiest among us, rather than on small businesses, rural entrepreneurs, and those communities still struggling to recover following the recession. There's time to shift that focus, and hearings like this one can help. In New Mexico, small businesses make up more than 95% of all businesses and employ more than 55% of private sector workers. They are the heart and soul of our state's economy. There are companies like RiskSense in Albuquerque that help firms assess and manage their cybersecurity risk. Founded as a small business technology transfer from the New Mexico Institute of Mining and Technology, the company now has 100 employees and earnings growing 50% annually. It's a great success story, and we certainly need more of them. At the national level, startup activity has picked up in the past 3 years, but the share of startups has declined by almost half since the 1970s. New firms are increasingly concentrated in a few big cities and states. One report found that just 20 counties were responsible for half of the net increase in new businesses from 2010 through 2014. And the share of startups created by veterans and in rural areas are both down in the past 2 decades. There are a number of actions that we should take to boost startup activity, few of which have anything to do with the tax code. It's vital that we strengthen the basic economic foundation, more jobs, higher wages, and improved access to education and healthcare. And we must lay the groundwork for startup activities in rural areas. That means increasing access to capital, speeding the deployment of broadband in rural communities, and taking other steps to ensure that rural and tribal areas are able to compete when it comes to startup activity. We also should be clear about what will not help small firms. Big tax cuts for large established companies do nothing for startups, which have little to no taxable income in those critical early years while working to get their businesses off the ground. And it does little for small businesses in need of capital to grow, capital that has been shrinking and drying up since the recession. As we've seen time and again, tax giveaways for large corporations and our highest earners do nothing to help small businesses, rural communities, and working people get ahead. And it leaves fewer and fewer dollars to invest in roads, in schools, in entrepreneurs and working families, compounding the challenges facing small cities and towns across our country. The primary goal of reform should be to use the levers we have to level the playing field. 1, because it's the right thing to do, and 2, because every American should have the opportunity to turn their dream into a reality. A zip code should not determine a child's success or her chances of starting a business. The entrepreneurial spirit is alive and well from Las Cruces, New Mexico to Boston, Massachusetts. It's our job to make sure we give every American the same chance to succeed, no matter their background. 2 things we could do right now to boost our economy and put more money into the pockets of working families are expanding the Earned Income Tax Credit and strengthening the Child Tax Credit. Our focus needs to be on creating better opportunities for the folks on Main Street, not delivering more tax breaks for investment bankers on Wall Street. We have an opportunity this Congress to work together to craft a bipartisan tax reform package that promotes entrepreneurship, simplifies our tax code, and puts more money in the pockets of working people. If we do that, we will give Main Street the boost it desperately needs. I'm certainly ready to get to work, and I look forward very much to this panel's testimony.
Thank you. Now on to our panel of witnesses. John Dearie is the founder and president of the Center for American Entrepreneurship, a nonpartisan research policy and advocacy organization that focuses on the importance of entrepreneurs and startups to innovation, economic growth, and job creation. He is the former acting CEO of the Financial Services Forum, spent 9 years at the Federal Reserve Bank in New York, and is the co-author of Where the Jobs Are, Entrepreneurship and the Soul of the American Economy. Welcome. Scott Hodge is the president of the Tax Foundation in Washington, D.C., and is recognized as as Washington's leading experts on tax policy. During his tenure, the Tax Foundation has become one of the most influential organizations on tax policy in Washington and in state capitals. Among other things, he has authored over 100 studies on tax policy and government spending. Scott began his career in Chicago, where he helped found the Heartland Institute before joining the Tax Foundation. Scott was Director of Policy and Budget Policy at Citizens for Sound Economy. He also spent 10 years at the Heritage Foundation analyzing budget and tax policy. Welcome back, Mr. Hodge. Ms. Falon Donohue is the CEO of VentureOhio, a for-impact organization created to promote collaborative statewide ecosystem that supports entrepreneurs, including by increasing access to angel and venture capital for Ohio startups. Prior to her tenure at VentureOhio and while serving our country in the Ohio Air National Guard, she began her career in technology solution sales and business development. Thank you for your service to our country and for your service to entrepreneurs, and we look forward to hearing from you. And last but not least, John Arensmeyer is founder and CEO of Small Business Majority, an organization focused on empowering America's entrepreneurs to build and thrive in an inclusive economy. In the past few years, he has spearheaded the growth of Small Business Majority's Entrepreneurship program, providing resources to our nation's 28 million small businesses. He was also the founder and CEO of ACI Interactive, an award-winning international e-commerce company. Welcome, and look forward to your testimony. With that, Mr. Dearie, you can begin, and you have 5 minutes, and we look forward to your testimony.
Chairman T. Berry, Ranking Member Heinrich, and members of the committee, thank you very much for the invitation to testify today. Your focus on tax reform and entrepreneurship hits the bullseye of what, in my view, is the nation's foremost domestic policy challenge, and that is accelerating economic growth. As members of the committee are no doubt aware, the U.S. economy has been mired in a rut of subpar performance for more than a decade. After expanding at an average annual rate of about 3.4% for most of the post-World War II era, the economy has not grown at 3% or better since 2005. That's for almost 13 years now, and has averaged only 2.2% since the end of the Great Recession more than 8 years ago. Weak economic growth means less opportunity, diminished job creation, lower wages, increased economic anxiety, and greater dependence on government assistance. To meaningfully address these challenges and the anger, cynicism, and populism they inspire, we must accelerate economic growth back to the historical average and on a sustained basis. Economic growth comes principally from gains in productivity driven by innovation, which comes disproportionately from new businesses or startups. Nearly all of the major innovations that have defined the economic landscape over the past 150 years, the railroad, the telegraph and telephone, the automobile electrification, the airplane, air conditioning and refrigeration, the computer, countless applications of the internet, and wireless communications all came from entrepreneurs. Moreover, recent research has shown that startups also account for virtually all net new job creation. And yet, as you pointed out in your opening statement, Chairman, American entrepreneurship is in trouble. From 2000 to 2006, the economy produced an average of 510 new firms each year. Since 2009, however, the number of new businesses launched annually has dropped to about 400,000, meaning that the United States currently faces a startup deficit of almost 100,000 new firms each year. Even more alarming, as economists Bob Lighton and Ian Hathaway have shown, the number of new firms as a percentage of all firms has fallen near a 30-year low, and this decline is occurring in all 50 states, in all but a handful of 360 cities they examined, and across a broad range of industry sectors, including high technology. Given the critical role that startups play as the principal source of innovation, gains in productivity, economic growth, and job creation, such circumstances amount to nothing short of a national emergency. Addressing that emergency by reversing the 3-decade decline in American entrepreneurship requires changes in public policy, which brings us to tax reform. The current tax code presents a number of challenges for startups, challenges that can amount to the difference between survival and failure. Specifically, the current code penalizes businesses with substantial early years losses, discourages investors from backing new businesses, and impedes successful new companies from expanding. The broad objectives of the Unified Framework for Tax Reform released by the administration and the tax drafting committees are very promising. Simplifying the code, broadening the base by eliminating loopholes, lowering business tax rates, allowing full expensing of business investment, and moving to a territorial system are the keys of a modern and competitive tax code. But as the Unified Framework itself states, it is only a template for the tax drafting committees. The essence of tax reform is the details, and we eagerly await specifics. Our hope is that reform will address a number of tax-related obstacles to entrepreneurship, including allowing startups to defer their income tax liability in order to conserve critical cash flow in the early years, allowing startups to carry forward net operating losses and R&D tax credits, expanding the application of R&D tax credits to startups' payroll taxes, and simplifying and expanding the favorable tax treatment of investment in new startups. So, Mr. Chairman, economic growth comes from gains in productivity, driven by innovation, which comes disproportionately from startups. Revitalizing American entrepreneurship, therefore, is the essential pathway to faster economic growth and the opportunity, jobs, and wage growth the American people need and deserve. Tax reform that includes a special focus on the unique tax-related vulnerabilities of startups is a critical part of America's pro-growth agenda. Thank you again for the invitation to participate.
Thank you. Mr. Hodge, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Senator Heinrich, members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today about how to make our tax system more friendly to entrepreneurship. The Tax Foundation's mission is to work toward a tax code that does not stand in the way of success, so we applaud this effort to try to remove the tax barriers to entrepreneurship. And despite our Byzantine tax code, America is a land of entrepreneurs. The dynamism of our entrepreneurs, the willingness to try and possibly fail, is what separates the United States from every other nation on earth. And yet, for all the success stories that we hear, there are dozens of other firms that never got past the numerous speed bumps that the tax code places in front of their ambition and eventual success. Well, let's put ourselves in the position of in the shoes of Maria, a young entrepreneur who has invented a smart scooter, and look at the tax issues that she faces along the way. The first thing that she has to consider is what business form to make her business. She has a choice between a traditional C corporation and a pass-through firm. Both have advantages, both have disadvantages. If Maria chooses a C corporation form, her company faces 2 layers of tax, one at the entity level and a second at the shareholder level. If her company becomes successful enough, it will face one of the highest corporate tax rates in the industrialized world at 35%. If we include the shareholder taxes, the rate is over 50%. On the other hand, Maria could choose one of the 4 different pass-through business forms that face only 1 layer of tax. But a successful pass-through business owner can face income tax rates as high as 43.5%, which includes a top individual rate of 39.6%. If her company becomes really successful, her family business could end up facing the estate tax, which could take as much as 40% of everything that she built over a lifetime. The treatment of capital investments puts another speed bump in her way. When Maria's company is young and growing, she can expense her capital investments under Section 179. After her company is no longer small, it must comply with complex depreciation schedules that not only raise the tax cost of every capital investment she makes, it adds about $23 billion to the compliance costs of businesses large and small. There are all kinds of arcane aspects of the code that inhibit entrepreneurship, but let's take a minute to see what the unified framework proposes that could help entrepreneurs, starting with tax rates. Of course, the most dramatic of these changes is the lower corporate tax rates and pass-through rates that are proposed in the framework. It proposes a 20% corporate tax rate for C corporations and a top rate of 25% for pass-through business income. The 20% federal corporate tax rate would instantly lower the U.S. rate to one of the lowest in the industrialized world, making the U.S. one of the most attractive places to do business on earth. And the lower proposed tax rate on pass-through businesses offers some interesting issues. On the one hand, the lower rate will certainly make entrepreneurship more attractive. On the other hand, the large gap between personal wage rate and pass-through rate could encourage some business owners to reclassify their income as business income. So the committee and Congress needs to look at this very carefully and write strict rules to prevent that sort of behavior. Don't let the rulemaking or leave the rulemaking up to the IRS. On expensing, the framework's 5-year temporary bonus expensing provision is certainly a step in the right direction, but it falls a little short of what entrepreneurs in the economy really needs. Our economic modeling shows that temporary provisions don't deliver the economic growth of permanent provisions, not surprisingly, because they encourage capital investment today at the expense of capital investment tomorrow. The Tax Foundation's models suggest that moving toward full expensing for all businesses would encourage more entrepreneurial investment, and deliver permanent economic growth. The estate tax, the framework calls for eliminating the estate tax. Tax Foundation economists estimate that the economic benefits of repealing the estate tax will exceed any revenue losses that repeal would bring the Treasury. So in conclusion, Mr. Chairman, there's a tendency among lawmakers to want to do something to help entrepreneurs like Maria. You should avoid the urge to subsidize them or give them special treatment. Instead, you should aim to get the tax code out of the way of entrepreneurs by making it more simple, less burdensome, and eliminating all the anti-growth biases that are throughout the code. So thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you today about this important issue, and I look forward to any questions that you may have.
Thank you. Ms. Donohue, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman Dearie, Ranking Member Heinrich, and members of the Joint Economic Committee. Thank you for the invitation to provide testimony for this important hearing, and thank you, Chairman, for the kind introduction. I'm speaking to you today on behalf of VentureOhio's membership. We're the entrepreneurs, innovators, and investors who are creating high-paying jobs in the Midwest and changing the world we live in. And the topic of reviving entrepreneurship through tax reform is very important to the hearts and minds of the members of VentureOhio. But I'm also speaking to you today on behalf of a larger group of Midwesterners who are most affected by the growth and development of our new tech-based economy. These are my fellow veterans seeking to transfer the technical skills acquired while serving their country into high-paying jobs in their hometown. These are my young friends who want to build applications that will change the world at cool new tech companies, but don't want to leave their families for New York or California. And finally, these are the good people of Mansfield, Ohio, my hometown, and small towns across the Midwest who are seeking access to new technical jobs as they watch their current jobs become obsolete due to the rapidly changing pace of technology. The Midwest is in the midst of a renaissance. Abandoned warehouses and long forgotten parts of town and forgotten parts of the country are being repurposed as tech incubators. Startup company successes are dominating the headlines of local newspapers while the community surrounds them and cheers for their success. Ohio's best and brightest are starting to remain in the state and work at high-tech companies in lieu of leaving for the coasts. These startup founders are choosing this path to create some of the most innovative and disruptive companies of our generation. In the coming decade, startups will create whole new industries that will impact millions of jobs across our country. From autonomous vehicles to artificial intelligence, the impact of these companies will be swift and complete. In Ohio, we've seen massive growth in our startup ecosystem and venture activity, reaching its highest point in the history in 2016. From our latest research released in VentureOhio's 2017 report, venture capital investments increased 46% over the past 2 years, and in 2016 alone, $470 million was deployed into 210 Ohio startups. In addition, $631 million was raised by institutional investors to be deployed into Ohio companies in the near future. We've also seen the results of innovation and entrepreneurship through the acquisition of Ohio companies like CoverMyMeds, acquired earlier this year for over $1 billion. As the largest tech acquisition in Ohio's history, the sale was a major milestone for the Ohio entrepreneurial community and is setting the tone for what's to come. Success stories like CoverMyMeds in Columbus or Assurix Health in Mason, which was acquired in 2016, and many others each year demonstrate that it's an exciting time to create a startup company in Ohio. Startups are creating millions of new jobs, fueling research and development in the technologies of the future, and continuing America's innovation dominance. Without them, we might have to imagine a world without social networks, streaming TVs, or the on-demand delivery of nearly everything, but we might have to also imagine a world without life-saving drugs or the ability to more easily take drunk drivers off our roads. I speak with these investors and entrepreneurs every day who are creating massive risks to create jobs and grow our economy. These people are doing everything that they can to revitalize communities, create new jobs, create high-paying jobs in their hometowns, and they need our support. They need support from their communities, and they need support from their leaders, from you. They need a simplified tax code and access to capital. We believe the companies being created in Ohio today will be the next crop of the Apples, Googles, Airbnbs, and Facebooks. They will create millions of jobs and change a generation of families. This is the most exciting time Ohio entrepreneurship has seen in decades due to the hard work of the innovative entrepreneurs in our state, and I'm pleased to be with you today to speak about the ways that the federal government and a simplified tax code can help encourage future startups. Thank you. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. Like under a minute left. That's pretty impressive.
It's a record.
I think it is a record. Very good. Last but not least, Mr. Arensmeyer, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman. Vice Chair Lee and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to speak with you today about problems that can help promote entrepreneurship, policies that can help promote entrepreneurship. I've spent many years as a small business owner. I was the founder and CEO of ACI Interactive, an award-winning interactive communications company, which I ran for 13 years. Then 12 years ago, I founded Small Business Majority to empower America's entrepreneurs to build a thriving and inclusive economy. We have a network of more than 55,000 small business owners across the country with offices in Washington, D.C. and 8 states. We interact daily with small business owners and conduct scientific research on a wide variety of topics. In order to ensure our nation's job creators can thrive and help grow our economy, it's crucial that Congress focus on policy solutions that are targeted to help our nation's entrepreneurs succeed, most particularly the need for access to responsible credit and capital, affordable and quality health coverage, and tax reform that directly benefits Main Street small businesses. Regarding tax reform, we need a tax system that benefits small business owners who are focused on growing their enterprises, satisfying their customers, and making payroll. Right now, according to our polling, 90% of small business owners feel that our tax system primarily benefits wealthy corporate interests at their expense. We don't want special treatment, we just want a level playing field. That's why we're concerned by the current proposal for tax reform. While some are touting the plan as a boon for small businesses, the reality is that it will not actually benefit most Main Street businesses while adding at least $2.4 trillion to our budget deficit over the next 10 years. Specifically, some claim that the current proposal to cap the tax rate for pass-through entities at 25% would be a boon for America's entrepreneurs. In fact, this would impact only a handful of small firms. More than 87% of pass-through entities already pay a marginal tax of 25% or less. Moreover, if individual tax brackets of 12, 25, and 35% are passed, as is proposed, the pass-through entities that would benefit from the pass-through cap rate would include only the 1.8% earning $425,000 or more. And last but not least, a tax code with a large gap between top individual rates and top pass-through rates can potentially encourage wealthy individuals to game the system by simply declaring themselves pass-through entities. I think we've seen this in the experiment that Kansas ran. If Congress wants to offer a responsible tax cut for most Main Street small businesses and offset that cut with a reduction in existing loopholes, allowing all businesses to deduct a modest amount of their profits from the bottom up would have a much greater impact. As for corporate taxes, cutting the top rate would certainly help some of the minority of small businesses that are organized as C corporations. But doing so without getting rid of corporate tax loopholes would greatly increase the deficit. Economists from the Tax Policy Center estimate that reducing the corporate rate to less than 26% would be impossible to offset with just a reduction in loopholes. And a reduction as proposed to 20% would reduce federal tax revenue by $1.6 trillion over 10 years. We have a set of specific tax proposals that are included in my written testimony. A more critical issue for entrepreneurs is access to capital. Unfortunately, too many businesses, especially women and minority-owned firms and entrepreneurs in distressed and rural communities, are struggling to gain the capital they need to launch or grow their businesses. According to our scientific opinion polling, 90% of small business owners agree that access to capital is a problem. Statistics on lending to women and minority business owners are included in my written testimony, as are the specific reasons that small business borrowing has gotten so much more difficult since the recession. Finally, small business owners need reliable and affordable health care so they can invest their time and resources into growing and expanding their businesses. Prior to the implementation of the ACA, entrepreneurs and their employees comprised a disproportionate share of the working uninsured. Post-ACA, the uninsured rate for small business owners and employees and self-employed individuals has fallen dramatically, and millions of them have gained coverage from the marketplaces and from Medicaid expansion. Finally, the ACA has greatly reduced so-called job lock, a phenomenon where people are tied to their jobs as opposed to striking out on their own simply due to their inability to get health coverage. We have a set of specific access to capital and health care proposals that are included in my written testimony. Thank you again for inviting me to appear today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Mr. Dearie, you made a great point in your testimony about how world-class tax systems that promote economic growth lead to more entrepreneurship and often more jobs and more revenue. Can you expand upon that, how that strong growth and more startups becomes self-reinforcing?
They are related, and I didn't have time in my oral testimony to mention that a lot of the testimony and a lot of the agenda at the Center for American Entrepreneurship is based on roundtables that I and a colleague, as you know, Mr. Chairman, you attended the roundtable in Columbus, Ohio. We did them in 12 cities around the United States, asking entrepreneurs, very simply, what's in your way? Trying to get at why is this decline happening? And one of the things that they told us over and over again is that the economy simply isn't growing fast enough. Now, that has a lot to do with the fact that entrepreneurship is down, but there is this symbiotic, feedback loop kind of relationship between entrepreneurship and broader economic conditions. So to the extent that we can achieve tax reform that puts the American economy on a much more competitive posture vis-a-vis our foreign counterparts, to the extent that we can achieve tax reform that gets out of the way American business and increases the rate of economic growth, that in and of itself, improving the broad economic circumstances into which entrepreneurs are trying to launch their businesses and growing, will have this very positive feedback effect on entrepreneurship.
Thank you. Mr. Hodge, you and I have talked about full expensing for years, and we both agree that it's a good thing, but we're in a situation right now where there are limits to small business expensing. Bonus depreciation under current law is going to ultimately go away. Can you talk about what we would be foregoing in terms of simplicity, in terms of boosting economic job growth, if we simply left the current path on depreciation rules in place, in your opinion?
Well, let me just put it in a positive sense that moving to full expensing, our models indicate would be the most powerful tax change that you could make to, number one, spur economic growth, increase productivity, increase investment, and ultimately increase wages for working class Americans. And what we find is that a secondary benefit of full expensing is that it does something that rate cuts don't do. It removes dozens, if not hundreds, of pages from the tax code, greatly simplifying the amount of complexity that entrepreneurs and businesses have to face. We estimate that, or actually the IRS estimates that businesses spend about 448 million hours complying with depreciation schedules because they're so arcane at a cost of about $23 billion a year. So if you were to include that with the economic benefits that you get from full expensing, this is a very, very powerful tool, an engine for restarting economic growth and investment.
Thank you. Ms. Donohue, I'm thankful to VentureOhio for the support of the Investing in Opportunity Act, actually, for yours as well, your support as well. VentureOhio has been an incredible success story in our state of Ohio, but I know that there are challenges in terms of capital. And I'd like you just to expand on the challenge of venture capital being so concentrated on both the left coast and the right coast, and the impact that has on startups in the Midwest. If you could just expand on it.
Absolutely. It's had a tremendous impact. While we're very proud that over the last 2 years capital has increased by 46%, that still only accounted in 2016 for about 0.5% of venture capital distributed nationally. And as the 7th largest state in the United States, that's just not good enough. We're tracking a lot of really great data, but we're not able to track is how many incredible entrepreneurs left Ohio, how many of them have left the Midwest and started their company in California or New York. It's stories that I hear on the ground all of the time. I reached out for capital. There just simply wasn't enough. To launch a company, you're talking hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars to get to the level of a Facebook or LinkedIn. $631 million raised in Ohio last year is pretty incredible, but that's nothing compared to what one company in California would raise to get to exit. So we still have a very long way to go.
Great. Senator, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Arensmeyer, you mentioned that there are a number of small business and Main Street focused tax reform proposals I noticed there's a long list in your written testimony. Do you want to talk a little bit about what you think is most important from that list?
Sure, Senator, thank you. I think, as Congress considers, making changes to the tax code, you have to make some tough decisions. I mean, obviously, tax breaks for everybody, people would love them. But I think, our opinion is you need to focus on what is going to have the biggest impact at the most, reasonable cost. And for example, we've proposed, instead of cutting the top, the pass-through rates down to 25%, why not give small businesses the opportunity to deduct the first $25,000 of their income? That's going to impact every small business that actually pays taxes, which is about 75% of businesses in any given year. There's also the Investment Opportunity Act that the chairman mentioned. Definitely some of the proposals from the other witnesses about targeted benefits in the tax code for very specific types of investments, particularly in distressed communities. We definitely support that. Passing, changing the law that allowing self-employed individuals to deduct the FICA portion of their healthcare costs before they, right now they have to pay the tax on that when they earn it, and they don't get the benefit that a regular company does. So there are a whole host of expanding the small business tax credit under the ACA. So there's some very targeted things that can be done that are going to have a much broader impact on the majority of Main Street small businesses than what's been proposed right now.
So generally, I want to ask a question about whether or not we should pay for tax reform. Should it be revenue neutral? And I'll start with Mr. Arensmeyer, and we'll just go down the list.
We believe it should be revenue neutral. I mean, right now, there's, we've reduced our deficit in recent years, but I think to turn that around is going to have long-term disastrous effects on our economy. Ultimately, right now, we benefit from low interest rates, but ultimately, interest rates are going to go up if we continue this. And there's really no reason to do that. I mean, most decisions that businesses make, quite frankly, are actually not based on taxes. They're based on access to capital. They're based on whether they have adequate health care to go out and start businesses. They're based on the availability of qualified workers, including immigrants in their community, which have really driven a lot of the startup success stories you heard from the other witnesses are being driven by more expansive immigration laws. So there's a lot more going on than just taxes. And again, it comes down to a set of priorities. What is going to have the biggest impact, and how can this be done in a way that's not going to hurt the deficit?
Ms. Donohue.
Since my members have not formalized a position on this issue, I'd prefer to defer to my fellow witnesses.
There's nothing magical about revenue neutral tax reform. As we saw a few years ago when Congressman Dave Camp put together his tax reform blueprint, which was revenue neutral, the choices he made in order to make it revenue neutral actually neutralized the economic benefits that came from the plan. What you need to focus on is economic growth, don't get focused on the deficit, because that will lead you down the wrong path. The key is identifying the right policies that create economic growth, and over time, a lot of those policies can create the kind of growth that can claw back some of the revenue loss that might come from the tax cuts.
Wouldn't the flip side of that be the kind of tax cuts we did in 2001 and 2003, which didn't really create a situation where we were more competitive? Ended up driving up our deficit, gave away a lot of goodies, but didn't provide a fundamentally more competitive United States business environment.
Right, because they were too focused on individual tax cuts and things like child credits, which do very little for economic growth. The key policies for creating economic growth are, one, moving to full expensing for capital investment, lowering the corporate tax rate to competitive level, lowering individual tax rates so individual businesses are more successful, and making all of that permanent. That will achieve the kind of economic growth that the economy needs, and as a result, it'll be budget friendly in the long term as well.
Yeah, we certainly hope so. Mr. Dearie,
I would
we
agree
pay for tax reform?
I would agree with Scott that growth ought to be the top priority, but I would hope that tax reform would be deficit neutral. Chairman Teaberry asked me about the impact on entrepreneurship of broader economic circumstances, and I mentioned these roundtables that I and a colleague did around the country. Over and over and over again, at virtually all the roundtables, among the problems, among the policy failures that they mentioned, that comes out of Washington is the inability or unwillingness to deal with the national debt, which at that time was much lower than it is now. They see it plays into their overall confidence about business conditions and their confidence in the economy. We had folks tell us, when we look at the deficit, we see it, sort of as a proxy for future taxes, assuming we're ever going to pay this off. So it does feed into the confidence of entrepreneurs, their outlook as to economic strength, their willingness to launch businesses, to take risks, to hire. So I would hope that it would be, at its best, would be deficit neutral.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Paulson is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, also for holding this hearing today on a topic that I think is so important to thousands and thousands of entrepreneurs across the country, as well as Minnesotans, obviously. Just last week, I received an email from a constituent, Paula in Plymouth, Minnesota, who articulated what I've actually heard countless times. And she writes, quote, "I, along with America's small businesses and other hardworking taxpayers, have been struggling under high tax rates for years. It's time that we rally together to change that. Tax cuts for small businesses will do a substantial amount of good for the U.S. economy and everyone in it. Businesses would be able to use these savings to create more jobs, increase wages, and expand to new locations, which would provide a boost to the economy and ensure continued economic growth." And I couldn't have said this better myself. I strongly believe we owe it to Minnesota's innovators and startups and small businesses owners to fix a broken tax code. So with that in mind, Mr. Dearie, and maybe I'll just start with you. You noted in your testimony that 95% of all businesses and 85% of small businesses are pass-throughs, which means they're paying those taxes at an individual rate instead of the corporate rate. How important is it to have lower rates for both C corporations and for those successful entrepreneurs who are pass-throughs, especially since pass-throughs, they saw a massive increase in their top tax rate from 35% to up to 44.6% recently?
It's very important. As a matter of fact, I'll introduce another way to think about this that we've learned from a few entrepreneurs who've brought it to our attention. They have said, we talk a lot about access to capital. How am I going to get a bank loan? How am I going to attract angel investment or venture capital investment to my firm? Tax policy is an access to capital issue. Every April, the tax man comes and takes a third or 44, as you just mentioned, % of my operating capital and walks away. That can be the difference, they've told us, between failure and success. So holding on to what little revenue or profit or money that startups are making in those critical early years is absolutely vital to the chances that startup is going to survive and be able to grow and create jobs. So certainly tax rates or what the government takes away is a major determinative factor as to the survivability of startups.
Sure. And just to follow up on that, we live in this global economy where Americans can start up or they can move a business almost anywhere in the world. You can move capital at the click of a mouse. If you do an internet search today for starting a business overseas, you'll find a lot of advice on how to do exactly that and why it might actually benefit a startup to look overseas. So as we're looking at reforming the tax code and helping entrepreneurs in tax reform, is it important to not only consider how we tax them here in America, but also how our competitors are doing the same taxation or to attract companies?
That's absolutely right, and it's not just on tax reform. It's also on immigration policy, it's on education, et cetera. The rest of the world gets it. The rest of the world has figured out how important startups are to economic growth, that winning the 21st century in terms of economic competition is about attracting the best firms, the best new ideas, the best talent, and they are rolling out the red carpet for entrepreneurs all over the world, including ours. So you're absolutely right that we've got to get our game squared away, or we're going to lose this battle.
Mr. Hodge, do you have a perspective on that as well, in terms of the competition we face and the actions we should take?
Well, the United States has the highest corporate tax rate in the industrialized world. There are only 4 small jurisdictions that have slightly higher tax rates than us. But the rest of the world, as Mr. Dearie said, has gotten it. And as we stand still, we fall further and further behind. And it's not just on the corporate side, it's individual rates as well. And it's interesting to note that because we had high tax rates before the 1986 Tax Reform Act, the number of pass-through or small businesses was declining each and every year. And after tax rates fell from 50% to 28% in '86, we saw an explosion in the number of pass-through businesses because tax rates simply matter to entrepreneurship and business startups. And so the more that we move in that direction, I think the more that we're going to see entrepreneurship, the more we're going to see business startups, and the economy will begin to boom again.
Yeah. Ms. Donohue, do you see competition as a state in Ohio and Midwest like Minnesota, competition from around the world?
Absolutely. I don't believe that entrepreneurs in Columbus, Ohio, or in Ohio or in the Midwest see each other as competition. Their competition is global. We live in a global economy, and as you stated, access to capital can occur all over the world. So anything that we can do to keep our innovative entrepreneurs in our state, in our country, we're absolutely in support of.
I see I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just add one thing.
Quickly.
Yes, just I want to remind the committee on the pass-through rates. When you're talking about 39.6% and adding on state tax, et cetera, on top of that, you're talking about a small sliver of small businesses. Only 1.7% of pass-through entities pay at the 39.6% rate. 87% pay 25% or less, 70% pay 15% or less. So there's not a really close connection between most the taxation faced by most Main Street small businesses and the individual rate structure at the upper levels.
All right, I'm going to allow Mr. Hodge just to have a little bit of rebuttal here since we're both out of time.
No rebuttal, just some clarification. Over 55% of all pass-through business income is taxed at the highest tax rate. So while, yes, there are millions of small businesses who do pay at the lower rates, the majority of pass-through business income is taxed at that higher marginal rate.
All right, with that, I'm going to recognize Ms. Maloney for 5 minutes.
So thank you, Chairman Dearie, for holding this hearing, and all our panelists. I wholeheartedly agree that small businesses and startups are truly the lifeblood of our economy, and that the metrics clearly show that there has been a startup slump. The Kauffman Foundation found between 1978 and 2012, the number of companies less than a year old as a share of all businesses declined by nearly 44%, an astonishing number. And I agree that there is a great deal that we can do to improve the situation. But I am particularly optimistic about a new approach to speeding up the creation of new startups in the district I'm privileged to represent, where we literally just a month ago opened a new school called Cornell Tech, which is a partnership between Cornell University and Technion Israel, with the total and sole purpose of training entrepreneurs, innovators, tech firms. Cornell Tech is a new model for innovation incubators, which connects science, technology, and engineering researchers with venture capitalists looking to speed the application of new discoveries in labs to applications in the real world, thereby growing our economy. We've already had, before they even opened up, and they were planning it, several startups that have come out of this initiative. But I would like to say that it's not just taxes, although everybody would like to get a tax cut. There are other factors, such as immigration and health insurance, and I'd like to ask Mr. Arensmeyer, I'd like to ask you about health insurance. I noticed a very interesting post on your small business majority website that was titled, "Defeat of the Affordable Care Act Repeal Measure is a Big Victory for Small Businesses," noting that if the bill had passed, people would likely have lost their health care coverage thanks to the measure's gutting of Medicaid and the subsidies that were the primary driver of coverage expansion under the Affordable Care Act. And you noted and estimated it would cost our economy over 580,000 jobs. Could you expand on your concerns for us? This is an ongoing debate before Congress.
Sure, Congressman. The rate of the marketplaces and the expansion of Medicaid have made it possible for millions of not only small business owners and small business employees who were not receiving job-based health care to get coverage, and millions of self-employed entrepreneurs. In fact, last year on the California exchange alone, 25% of all people who signed up for Covered California were self-employed individuals. So for the first time, I talked about job lock in my testimony. For the first time, you have a situation where the ability to get health coverage is not driving decisions to start or grow small businesses. So we've seen a huge boon in entrepreneurial activity as a result of the Affordable Care Act, allowing people to simply get health care when they couldn't before.
Okay, I'd like also to question Mr. Dearie on immigration. And a report on your website's Center for American Entrepreneurship notes that immigrants are twice as likely as native-born Americans to start businesses. And you noted a study by the Partnership for New York American Economy found that 40% of Fortune 500 companies were founded by foreign-born entrepreneurs or a child of immigrants. And a 2012 study found that foreign-born researchers were involved in more than 75% of the patents awarded at the nation's top 10 research universities. So it would seem to me that current efforts to cut back on immigration that would supposedly help spur job growth is actually more like cutting off our nose to spite our face. Your piece is titled "Robust Immigration is America First." Could you expand on that for us?
Thank you. That piece is commenting on the RAISE Act that was recently introduced, as you know, by Senators Cotton and Perdue. One thing the senators are trying to do, they are absolutely right about, and that is that we do need to achieve a shift in our immigration system to attract more high-skilled immigrants. Right now, about 80% of the about 1.1 million green cards that we allocate each year go for purposes of family reunions, asylum seekers, et cetera. Only about 15% go to high-skilled immigrants. The rest of the world is exactly the opposite. I personally am of the view that those humanitarian aspects of our immigration policies are very important. It's part of what the United States is about. But I am in agreement that we do need to do a better job and achieve something of a shift toward more high-skilled immigrants, a better balance, if you will. The problem, in my view, and the view of my co-author of that piece, Doug Holtsagen, is that, number one, the RAISE Act does not raise the number of high-skilled immigrants. It keeps the current cap, at 140,000, and it simply slashes everybody else. Senator Cotton himself said that within a few years of enactment of the act, that 80% that I referred to would be cut in half. That is absolutely anti-growth. Growth in our labor supply is a very important part of economic growth, and the largest part of our growth in our labor supply, because of demographic tendencies and the retirement of the baby boom generation in recent years, has been growth in immigration. Moreover, as you point out, we want to attract the best and the brightest, and it's in our interest to do so.
My time has expired.
Thank you. Before I recognize Mr. Rooney, Mr. Arensmeyer, the topic of, little off to our topic, of health care for small businesses come up a couple times now. Would you be willing to meet with me afterwards? I'd like to share with you a true story of a woman-owned business in Ms. Donohue's hometown, small business owner, manufacturer, less than 50 employees in the small group market, and her health care has tripled. Her costs have tripled over the last 3 years. And the impact that has had, not only to her small business, but to her employees, is that they're paying more and getting less health care. So as a guy who represents small businesses, I'd like you to hear this story. It's pretty amazing. With that, Mr. Rooney, back on topic, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the chance to speak and for you holding this great hearing. As the House co-sponsor of the RAISE Act, I'd just like to say why I did it. I think it's very important that we focus on skills. I have thousands of employees. We need low-skilled and high-skilled workers in this country to drive it, because no country has ever improved itself and grown economically without higher productivity driven by more productive and young workers. So Tom's view of how many refugee or immigrant visas should be allowed would be debated, I would hope, by our colleagues and modified. But the principle of ending chain migration, I think, is critical to accomplish some of the things you all have talked about. Since The comment was also made about that people don't locate their business because of taxes. And I'd just like to say that if you believe that, then look at Texas, Florida, and Ireland, where I have businesses in all those places. Now, I'd like to ask a question about the pass-throughs, because I think the pass-throughs are critical. You know, when you have billion-dollar companies that are pass-throughs and are willing to pay the extra 5 or 6% asymmetry, they must have a lot of value to the economy as well as for startups. And so we know that small businesses are the job creators and that they use pass-throughs, but also larger companies use pass-throughs because of the simplicity of the capital structure. I know I do every time we do a real estate deal. So the comment was made about diversion of salary because of the 25% rate, Mr. Hodge. And don't you think that it's possible that the extra jobs that would be created by that extra 1/3 after-tax income by the 25% rate that would involve more salary workers rather than owners of business would offset any kind of lost tax revenue that an owner may take less salary?
Well, I think they're kind of different issues. I see your point, but I think you have to be extremely careful about creating arbitrage opportunities. And pass-throughs already have a benefit of one layer of tax. And albeit if you were to then reduce the rate even further, you do create arbitrage opportunities. And you have to be very mindful of that in writing the legislation so that
Oh, sure.
people don't
I
do that.
understand.
You don't want
but-
the doctor to be able to reclassify his income as pass-through.
Well, and the IRS has some rules about that as well. But there's got to be a pretty strong impact of putting 1/3 more after-tax income in every pass-through entity's pocket in terms of what they do with that money and the jobs they might create with it.
Yes, there is, but I'll just leave it at that. It's going to be a thorny issue. I just warn you about that. And I'm all in favor of lower taxes on businesses because I do think that that spurs more capital investment and spurs growth. But I do think you have to worry about these opportunities in the tax code for people to play games. And you have to be extremely careful about it.
Well, that's for sure. Let me ask you one more. This may be a little off the subject, harebrained idea. A Fortune 100 CEO friend of mine proposed it. What if the repeal of the death tax were limited to bequests which go to blood relatives? If they don't give it to a blood relative, why don't they just pay the tax? So we all share in it.
Well, do you really want the government to dictate where people give their money?
Well, they do it now. A million
That's
ways.
the point. That's why we want to get rid of the estate tax and get the government out of the death industry. But I love the sentiment, and I do think too many families have been disproportionately harmed because of the estate tax and family
That's the
businesses.
point, yeah.
But at the same time, I think, again, want to be careful about this body making determinations on where people believe that they should put their money. And, you know, if a guy's got a kid who's, basically a
This is the
ne'er-do-well.
body that created renewable fuel standards.
What?
This is the body that created the renewable fuel standards. Talk about where to incentivize your money.
That's right. I rest my case.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much.
You bet.
Thank you. Mr. Byer is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for your testimony. I found it fascinating. Mr. Arensmeyer, Mr. Dearie's testimony notes, he has the chart about new entrants, and it starts to collapse in 2005, and I'm not aware of any major change in tax policy around 2005 that have had such a crippling impact on new business formation. As you pointed out, very few startups have heavy tax burdens. Only a very small percent pay the top corporate rate. Mr. Hodge pointed out that 55% of pass-through income is at that high rate, but as the principal in the 12 different pass-throughs, let me tell you that's almost all from large, mature, established pass-throughs, some that have been around for decades, not the startups, not the entrepreneurs that this hearing addresses. Wouldn't it make sense to conclude that the decline in new business formation is primarily not a tax story, but that other factors and policies are more critical? For example, college debt, barriers to entry in so many different businesses, access to capital, which we've talked about. Mr. Arensmeyer.
Yes, Congressman. I would absolutely agree. There are myriad reasons why the opportunity for to start up goes up or goes down. I should point out that our period of greatest economic growth recently, and one where we actually temporarily closed the budget deficit, was in the 90s when we had passed you all had passed a tax cut in a tax increase in 1993. And there really wasn't, any relationship between that and the fact that the economy was really booming. You're absolutely correct. It's access to capital, access to health care, access to a qualified workforce, which includes, immigrants who are, by the way, twice as likely to start new businesses as the national average. It's a whole host of factors that you cited. And I don't want to imply that taxes aren't irrelevant, but all the polling that we have done shows that the concern about a robust economy, access to health care, are ranked far higher than taxes as a major reason for making business decisions.
Mr. Arensmeyer, to continue, Ben Castleman wrote recently in the New York Times, quote, "The slump in entrepreneurship has coincided with a period of increased concentration in nearly every major industry. I was raised as an automobile dealer. There were 50,000 car dealers the year I was born. We're down to about 17,000 right now. Something like AutoNation, I think, sells 16 or 17%, one company, of the new cars sold in America. What's the impact of this concentration in industry after industry on the ability to start a new company?"
I think it's made it more challenging. I think, again, there's no question that some industries, it's okay to grow, and some industries the product is delivered much better by a larger entity, but we need a balance between excessive concentration and to make sure that we're not stifling the opportunity for small businesses to begin and grow.
One of the things I see is I have 3 millennial children who are all entrepreneurial, and when I visit the startups, the equivalent of Ohio Venture in Virginia, they're wonderful, they're great energy, but they're all looking for something brand new. They're not starting firms that have been around for a long time. And so it really creates maximum creativity to try to think of some place that's never existed before and starting there. Mr. Arensmeyer, you also talked about the limited benefit of full expensing. I think for Mr. Hodge, I unfortunately look at these things through my own family business experience and think, boy, if we could full expense, I have all these buildings, boom, wonderful for 2017 taxes. But then after that, I'm paying taxes on my interest expense for years and years to come. Have you looked hard at the trade-off between taking away interest deductibility versus the full expensing?
Well, interest deductibility is something that's taken, across the board on a percentage basis by large and small business entities. So we're not necessarily in favor of reducing that because, in fact, it's harder for smaller businesses to get access to equity capital, and they're often, debt is a higher percentage of what's fueling them. So their ability to deduct interest on a percentage basis is actually often greater than a larger company. As far as full expensing is concerned, obviously right now under Section 179, small businesses can essentially do full expensing up to $500,000 a year, and we don't see a huge benefit to smaller entities to change the law to allow for full expensing for much larger entities.
Okay, I'm going to try to squeeze in 26. Ms. Donohue, you did a valiant job trying to defend carried interest. And you're the first to really see that differentiated between venture capitalists and private equity. In fact, most of my experience in Virginia has been well-established, very wealthy individuals risking somebody else's money to get a capital gains rate on it. Is there a way to differentiate carried interest between venture capitalists and private equity?
Well, most of the venture capitalists in Ohio, in fact, all that I can think of off the top of my head, also invest in those funds. The average venture capital fund size in the U.S. is $22 million, which results in about $400,000 per year in management fees. And $400,000 per year to pay the partners, to pay their CFO, to pay keep the lights on, to keep the rent. That's not how they're making their money. The reason they do this is for the opportunity to earn carried interest once the fund is successfully deployed and they earn the income back. And for us to keep these venture capitalists in Ohio who are very talented individuals who could make a lot more money in New York or California, they could, but they're choosing to remain in Ohio, they're choosing to be pioneers, they're choosing to make less, have the opportunity to make less money because they believe in the future of Ohio and they believe in supporting entrepreneurship.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Good question. I'd like to now recognize breaking news that Congress's connoisseur of coffee from Arizona, Mr. Schweikert.
Look, I don't go around making fun of your problems. But we're thinking of starting a 12-step group for coffee. We're holding the meetings Tuesday at Starbucks. Oh, come on, that's funny. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And a couple things I wanted to sort of run through, and I've been making some little side notes. First off, just a couple things data-wise that have been thrown out. Substantial number of LLCs, partnerships are actually held to hold assets and don't actually, if you actually look at the distributional curve of where they are on the IRS forms, they're producing actually very little income because they're actually a tort liability shield. So it's actually quite distorting to actually put those into your base numbers, and we all know better, so I was a little surprised to have someone actually distort the discussion that way. Mr. Hodges, just because I think, and please correct me, are you the only one on the panel that actually works with an organization that actually does large-scale data modeling?
Yes.
With, shall we say, where you have a robust enough data set to actually model the model on the model, you know, each time with the velocity changes?
Yes, we have a macroeconomic tax model, some might call it a dynamic model, that measures the effect of tax changes on the cost of capital and the supply of labor. And in doing so, we're able to then look at the effects of tax policy on the size of GDP, investment, wages, jobs, and of course, federal revenue.
Now, why this is important, I think, to all of us sitting up here on the right and the left, is if you actually look where we are in our demographic curve, I think there's a common understanding in a decade, decade and a half, we're in real trouble. Where our aging of our population, our entitlement promises, our ability to have enough economic expansion to actually cover those entitlement promises. Almost every dynamic model hits a wall. And so having an honest conversation here that's a little less of, this gets me reelected, this is best for economic expansion. So if I came to you right now and said, let's be blind to my next election, what would the most growth-oriented tax model be that gives every American an opportunity to actually save and have employment and have wage growth? What would that model look like? Because you're actually using real data instead of feelings.
Sure. Well, the paradox of tax reform is that the tax changes that are most politically popular, such as lowering individual tax rates and child credits and so forth, do the least for economic growth because they incentivize very little about people's work effort.
I know we have the buzzers going off. Can you say that again? Because this is actually really uncomfortable for those of us who got in front of audiences and talked about doubling the child care credit or some of these other things. And the reaction we get when we actually show what happens to your future job prospects if we put the money here compared to expensing.
Compared to expensing. And so, yes, again, the individual tax changes do the least for economic growth, whereas tax changes that affect the cost of capital, such as moving to full expensing, lowering the corporate tax rate, lowering business tax rates, actually have the greatest effect on not only economic growth, but ultimately productivity and wages and after-tax incomes. And that's really should be the goal of fundamental tax reform, is lifting living standards, not just putting money in people's pockets, but actually lifting their living standards for the long term. A tax cut in my pocket is nice, but I'd sure like a higher wage and higher living standards at the end of the day.
Well, in continuing this sort of logic loop, for those of us who are absolutely fixated on how we're going to cover our social entitlement promises in a decade plus, the size of our economy, the ability to have a tax base that has grown, which model gets us there?
It's the policies that create the most growth, as I mentioned, lowering the corporate tax rate, lowering business tax rates, lowering the cost of investment. All of those things lead to a higher GDP and solve the problems that really are facing us that Mr. Dearie mentioned in terms of Social Security problems, entitlement problems, et cetera. Growth solves so many problems. That has to be the goal of tax reform.
And here's where we will all, those of us who are policymakers, are going to have some soul searching to do. Do we pander to our politics, which is what we do, it's how we get elected, or do we do actually quality math that grows our economic base and gives society a fighting chance to have that higher wage, that better job, and for us to have enough revenues to keep our promises? With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Adams, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for your testimony. Right now, the vast majority of pass-through entities, 86% to be exact, are taxed below 25%. So ostensibly, the tax break is for the remaining 14% of pass-through entities, most of which are individuals in the top 1% of economic distribution. Mr. Dearie, would the remaining 14% of pass-through entities really provide enough economic growth to justify opening a potentially large tax loophole for law firms, hedge funds, and other profitable businesses to exploit and avoid contributing their fair share in taxes? Wouldn't the pass-through setup just shift the tax burden to the middle class?
Well, I would answer the question by saying I think it's very, very important that however the tax drafting committees handle tax rates pertaining to pass-throughs, that they do it in a way that does not open up the kind of loopholes to which you're referring. I've heard the various figures today about exactly what portion of pass-throughs actually pay what taxes. I suppose that is, you know, I've heard arguments and data on both sides. I think it's important to get tax rates right, both because it's important for competitive purposes. Also, tax rates send a signal, and they contribute to the confidence of business people as to whether or not they're even going to go about, you know, the trouble of launching a business, their confidence as to their ability to survive. So, in my mind, regardless of which fraction of which pass-throughs pay which rate, I think getting the tax rates right and competitive is very important for both tax as well as psychological reasons.
Thank you. Mr. Arensmeyer, as you are aware, revenue neutrality is a key component of tax reform, but to do so, major changes are needed to offset the cost of lowering tax rates. One such provision being considered is eliminating interest deductibility. So does it make sense to eliminate this provision to help pay for reform, or would you advocate keeping it?
As I said earlier, Congresswoman, small businesses use the interest deductibility on a percentage basis at least as much as larger businesses, if not more. I think there are other, if you're looking for other offsets in the tax code, for example, the offshore deferral, which costs $1 trillion over 10 years, not only does that not benefit any small businesses, it actually doesn't benefit most large businesses. About 50 to 60 multinational corporations take most of that benefit. So there are other provisions in the tax code you can look to other than interest deductibility to look for offsets. And we would agree that perhaps some reduction in the corporate rate makes sense. We would agree that some of what's been proposed by us and others here on the panel in terms of targeted incentives for venture capital and other types of investing. So you will need to be looking for offsets, but I'm not sure the interest deductibility is the place to look.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to yield back.
Ms. Comstock's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I welcome my constituent, Mr. Dearie. Thank you for being here. And Mr. Hodge, I think this is the first hearing we've had since we worked back in the 90s when I was staff, and you were very helpful on these issues, so appreciate seeing you again. I wanted to talk about growth again, because I know from my experience in the State House, we always had to look at who are we competing with states. Give you an example, we worked on data center taxation because we have a large data center industry in Virginia, but our taxation was not competitive with other states. And so as we went to look at it, of course, this was during a Republican administration, they were telling us what it'll cost this much if we change the taxation model. The problem was entire businesses were getting up and leaving, as they can in the tech industry. So, when we realized the multiplier would be zero, then, it doesn't matter what the rate is, when you have the multiplier being zero. So I really do think it's so important for us to focus on that rate, because actually when we did lower our rates, the data center industry stayed here, grew here, got people from all over the country coming here, and obviously that helped with our tech industry. So I was wondering, Mr. Dearie, you're talking about the pass-through rate, the corporate rate, and given that we're so much higher than the rest of the world, and tech businesses can go anywhere and leave, could you address that in terms of the competition? Because competition is all at 12. If I'm trying to pay for how I get down to 12, I'm losing my business, aren't I?
Yes, and as I mentioned earlier in response to another question, if you look around the world, and it's not just on taxes, it's on immigration, it's on education, it's on training, et cetera, it's on access to capital, but certainly on taxes, the rest of the world gets it. I mean, look at the steps that our competitors have taken. Countries like France and Great Britain now have tax rates, substantially below the United States. They get it. We always tend to talk about them as being, socialistic economies, et cetera, but they get that taxes matter for exactly the purpose that you're talking about. Corporations are more, and businesses are more mobile today, given advances in technology and what have you. They can go anywhere. And it's very, very important for us to be on the playing field.
And when we're talking about competition too, it's those high-end jobs, as you're talking about in terms of immigration, and so the visas and technology that then will generate those new growth disruptive industries. So having that lower pass-through rate, the lower corporate rate is particularly important. And maybe if Mr. Hodge, you might want to address that, Ms. Donohue, in terms of getting the highest, being competitive in the growth areas all around the globe. That is essential, that we are not going to, if we're going to attract the talent, we also have to have those lower rates.
Economists at the OECD studied the effects of different types of taxes on economic growth and found that the corporate income tax is the most harmful tax for economic growth. And it's particularly harmful for the most job-producing, growth-producing, energetic companies, and the ones that really, as Mr. Dearie said, have generated the most toward new advances in various things, whether it's technology or what have you. And so that's, as he said, the rest of the country, the globe gets it. And corporate tax rates have fallen dramatically all over the globe.
I mean, something like the medical device tax industry, we're losing that because of that extra taxation here, as well as...
Yeah, more than 60 companies have left the United States and re-domiciled in places like Ireland and Switzerland and the Netherlands because of lower corporate tax rates.
Yeah, and could I ask, for the record, that if you could provide us all those companies that have left and any documentation that you might want to add to that, I think would be helpful for the record. And Ms. Donohue, if you want to address that.
I'll just add that a healthy corporate environment is essential for a healthy entrepreneurial ecosystem. To be successful, startups need access to talent and access to capital. And access to capital means access to customers, which are the corporations who are thriving in their region that can provide both of those.
And then having that healthy startup also keeps the bigger businesses more competitive, because they have to compete with the startups. The ecosystem that's created with that kind of keeps everybody honest and on their toes and far more innovative. And when we lose that startup piece, we really sort of atrophy everywhere else, don't we?
Yeah, it's healthy all the way around. We call it innovate or die. It's important for the corporations, it's important for the startups. They feed off of each other. They're primary economic drivers for our cities and to keep our college students within the state, because they want to work at cool tech companies. They want to work at cool corporations.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Delaney is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing. I want to thank all the witnesses for being here and providing your insight. So this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. Before coming to Congress, I was an entrepreneur. I started my first company in the early 90s. I took it public in 1996. I was the youngest CEO of the New York Stock Exchange at the time, sold it in 99, started my second business in 2000, took that public in 2003, and ran it till I decided to run for office. Ernst & Young gave me the Entrepreneur of the Year award. So I've spent a lot of time around entrepreneurship. And my second business was a commercial finance company, which meant we lent money to small to mid-sized businesses, and we lent $30 billion to 3,000 small to mid-sized businesses all over the country. And So when I think about being an entrepreneur, the thing that has struck me about this hearing is this notion that tax policy matters to entrepreneurs. Being an entrepreneur is about a dream. It's about thinking you can change the world. It's about thinking you have some innovation that can make a disproportionate difference in the lives of your community, your country, your people. It's about wanting to be independent, to chart your own path, to be a pioneer. Those are all the emotions of an entrepreneur. I have never met an entrepreneur who was making a decision about whether to be an entrepreneur based on tax policy. Because in fact, most startup companies don't make money for a while. And most entrepreneurs would say, God, I hope to pay taxes one day, because that means my business is working. And to me, what allowed me to start my businesses is, I was married to a wonderful woman who had a job, who that job gave us health care, and she was supportive of me doing this, so I could take the risk because we had that security in our own situation. I started my business in a market here in the DC area in Chevy Chase, Maryland, where we had access to really terrific employees. And that allowed me to raise capital because I had an idea, a plan, I was able to go do it, I was able to get a team, and I went around the country and pitched people to give me money, which in the early 90s was hard. Now it's relatively easy, not for venture capital, so Ms. Donohue thinks right, but for more professionally managed capital because that's just a better risk return for most people than venture capital. So this notion of, I guess, Mr. Dearie, you said something earlier about how tax policy matters to entrepreneurs and startups. But right now, 80% of the professionally managed venture capital goes to Northern California, New York, and Massachusetts, 3 of the highest tax places in the country. How do you explain that if tax policy matters to these investors?
You're absolutely right, Congressman, that very few entrepreneurs think about tax policy as they're thinking about becoming an entrepreneur, that they're driven by passion, they're driven by an idea, exactly as you said. So
why does all the money go to the highest tax places?
Well, because in talking about the importance of tax policy, I certainly don't mean to say it is the silver bullet issue. It is the most important issue. It is the dispositive issue. Right. It's relevant. It's important. How do I know?
The most important issue, take back my time, the most important issue is creating that environment where people actually go want to start a business.
I agree.
So, if you had to make a choice, and you have to answer the question based on my choice, you could either cut the estate tax or increase investments in research and development. What would you choose to create more entrepreneurs?
I would do the latter.
Invest in research and development. Yes. Mr. Hodge, if you had a choice, which was to lower the tax rates on wealthy individuals, thank you for that honest answer, Mr. Dearie, lower the tax rates on wealthy individuals, or do something like allow people with unrealized capital gains to sell those positions and defer paying their capital gains tax for 10 years if they invest that money in parts of the country that have very little economic growth, some of the regions that Ms. Donohue's advocating for. Which would you choose? Those were your only 2 choices.
I don't agree with using the tax code to try to micromanage people's investment decisions.
So you don't think it's important to create policies? Because really what's happened in this country is...
No, I don't...
Let me finish my time. You don't believe in policies that actually help put intellectual capital and real capital in parts of our country that have been hollowed out based on changes in our economy. To create more entrepreneurs like Mr. Arensmeyer, if I'm pronouncing that right, because you sound like a great entrepreneur, sir. Yeah, you don't think that's a role of tax policy?
We've tried things like enterprise zones for decades, and they've had limited effect. And I think we ought to reconsider those policies.
Ms. Donohue, do you think it would be useful to have policies that get capital flowing to parts of the, like Ohio, where you're trying to actually get investment capital?
I do. Brilliance is not concentrated in 3 states in the United States, right, but capital is. So
and we got to do something about that problem. Great. Thank you for your time, everyone.
Last but not least, Mr. LaHood is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the witnesses for your valuable testimony here today. I wanted to see if I could focus just for a couple minutes on rural America, and there obviously seems to be a trend of people and resources and innovation moving to bigger cities and less so in what I call smaller non-urban areas. And I'm wondering if
if we have examples of rural areas or non-urban areas that have succeeded in innovation, and whether the tax code, as we look at reforming the tax code, whether we can help with that, incentivize that. And I also look at statistics. According to the Economic Innovation Group, from 2010 to 2014, half of the net growth in the number of businesses and 17% of the new unemployment took place in 5 metropolitan areas. And I guess looking at, does the tax code disadvantage rural areas, non-urban areas, burdening smaller enterprises as opposed to larger enterprises? And I guess, Mr. Dearie, if you could comment on that.
I don't think the tax code disadvantages those areas. I think those areas struggle with probably other issues. Access, the two big needs of entrepreneurs, as my colleague pointed out a moment ago, are access to talent and access to capital. In rural areas across the United States, I would say that those are the two biggest challenges. Tax policy can complicate that, but I would say that those are the real challenges for the rural areas to which you're referring.
And do you have any examples of rural areas that have succeeded and done well with innovation?
I would need to think about that and get back to you. It is true, it is absolutely true that generally speaking, or more than generally speaking, when you think about innovation and entrepreneurship, you're typically talking about cities.
Yeah. Ms. Donohue?
I would agree. We have a long way to go. We're very proud of the innovation occurring in Ohio and having the first billion-dollar exit occurring this year. But even in a city like Columbus, which is the 14th largest in the United States, we're still nowhere near access to talent and capital of our counterparts on the coast.
And do you have any suggestions as we look at comprehensive tax reform where we can help in that area?
A simplified tax code is, of course, beneficial to entrepreneurs, having access to more capital. So anything to simplify that and help entrepreneurs get that access. In Ohio, we have some statewide programs that have proven to be successful, such as the Ohio Third Frontier. This is capitalized venture capital funds and business development organizations that help provide access to capital and talent all over the state, including the more rural areas such as Mansfield, Ohio. But I think a program such as the Invest in Opportunity Act is a very smart way to get capital off of the sidelines and into the hands of innovative entrepreneurs who might not have access to capital, such as venture capitalists. It's a very small and tight-knit community, whether you live in Silicon Valley or you live in Ohio. Access to venture capitalists is not something that everyone has, and it's the small groups of people that do have access to these individuals. That's great for them, but it's not so great for somebody in Mansfield, Ohio, who wouldn't even know where to look. So ensuring that these different groups get to know each other, these innovative entrepreneurs in rural parts of the country, and the investors with capital, putting them together, I think magic could happen.
Thank you. Mr. Hodge, switching subjects, according to the Global Innovation Index, Switzerland, Sweden, and the Netherlands all rank above the United States in terms of innovation. The arguments for the reasoning behind this can vary, but I'm interested specifically in how the tax structures compare. What specifically about these countries' tax codes should the U.S. consider replicating so that U.S. businesses of all sizes can be more competitive globally?
They all have especially corporate taxes, much lower than the United States. And I think most people would be surprised that Sweden is actually a relatively low-tax country compared to the United States.
What is their rate, do you know?
It's 25%, I believe. And Switzerland is even much lower than that. And, of course, it depends upon which canton you move to. But all of those have structured their tax systems for business to be much more competitive, and especially for multinational businesses, they're extremely competitive places to do business.
Thank you. Those are all my questions. I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the witnesses again for being here today. It was a really good session, I believe. The record will be open for 5 business days for any member that would like to submit questions for the record or to our panelists. With that, the hearing is adjourned. Thank you.